Okay, I'm going to demonstrate this procedure that I did in texturing this boot. Okay, and so I'm going to be going over how I did the leather and how I did the rubber sole, and then how I did the strings and the little metal eyelets. So I'll be covering this whole thing. This is the leather part. There's metal that goes on this too, and I'll cover that in a different video. There's a metal tip that goes on it and a metal plate that goes up here, but I'll cover that in a different video. Now, this technique that I'm showing you is utilizing titleable textures. So instead of having to unwrap the object, we're just going to be using several titleable textures to create this look. So I wanted to show you how you can create a really nice look without having to actually unwrap something. And so that's what we're going to be doing. Now, I've already built this, so I'm just going to kind of deconstruct it and show you, how I created it. Okay, now I'm going to be demonstrating this in Max, but I'm really demonstrating a concept. The concept, I call this digital staining, that we're layering up textures and staining them on top. We're using layers, just kind of like what we do in Photoshop. Max has got a node called a composite node, and it works pretty much like layers in Photoshop. Maya has a layer node also. So you can do this technique in pretty much any 3D software. Okay, like I said, here is this 3D plate, a metal plate that's going to go on top of here. We're just going to go ahead and hide that. And I will do that in a different video on how to put the do the metal on there. Okay, so basically what we have here is several pieces. There's this piece of leather, then there's this piece that folds on top of it, and then there's a piece of leather up here as well. Okay, and then there's a sole, and then there's the laces, and we'll go over that. Now, let me go ahead. I already have a mesh smooth put on these. This was built so that you would do a mesh smooth with 2 iterations. Now what I've got is 1 iteration showing in the viewport, but it'll render 2. And so I'm going to just show you how I went about doing this. Okay. Now here is the shaders. Now there's several shaders in here for the other parts, but the main shader that I wanted to demonstrate to you today is the leather shader. Okay. And this is what the shader looks like. Okay, so basically it's an arch and design material. Then I've got a composite node into the diffuse slot, and I've got a composite node into the bump. The composite node is a special node in here that basically it creates layers. It's just like layers in Photoshop. So I'm creating layers. I've got blending modes of different ways that I can blend them together, just like you do in Photoshop, and I can do a percentage. So it's almost exactly like the layers in Photoshop, with the exception that I can put a mask in here too, which you can do that in Photoshop, I guess, also. So I'm going to show you, deconstruct this on how I built this. So we'll just start with the base layer. So we'll come in here and, now let's go ahead and apply this. Okay, now the way that I kind of do this is I'm going to be putting some traditional UVW map coordinates on this, and I'm going to be using box mapping. Okay. Now, box mapping on a round surface will give you some little seams in here, but if you're using a titleable texture like what I'm using, and these are just pseudo titleable texture, I didn't really go in and make really extensive titleable textures that I would if I was using it straight out, but because I'm using it as a stain, you won't see these irregularities that you might normally see. And so what I want to do is, when I'm doing this, I want to come on here and put my UVW maps on here while I've got all of them selected. You see how this is italicized? That means that I'm putting a map that's collective on all of these. Now, the reason I'm going to do that is because I'm going to build up 3 of these. And so it's easier if I put them all on here all at one time, or because I know the leather is going to go on all of these. Now, eventually I want them to be unique because I want to change the leather a little bit on each one of these. But initially I would put them on there like this. Okay. So on this first texture map I have on here, which is this one right here. Okay. I've got it on the first channel. So that's what you're going to do in here as well, is you will put this on channel 1, okay, which is what is default. Okay, now where I got the leather was just over on Google. Okay, so I just did a search for leather. Okay, titleable leather texture, and you'll see there's all kinds of ones in here. Okay, so you just got to find one that you like. Okay, the one I got was this one. Now, by the way, for my students, that you're going to be using this technique, you can use this technique, but you can't use the same textures as mine. So I don't want you to just copy in what I'm doing. I want you to come up with your own. So you can't use this texture. This one's mine. Okay. So that's the texture. There it is. And that's what I'm putting on there. Now, to see it on there, I turn this button on right here to show end result, and then I can actually see the texture on here. Okay. Now, when I put this on here, I want to turn it to box mapping. And then all I really care about the length, width, and height is that it's a perfect cube. Okay, so I'm going to type in something like 20 here, 20 here, and 20 here. And now you can kind of start seeing my grain. Okay, now you want this to be a cube because this is a perfect square. Okay, now some of the other stuff I'll use is not a perfect square, so we don't want it to be a cube. But in this case, we want this to be a cube. Now, the nice thing about this in Max is I can come in here and I can actually, instead of having to come in here and go, well, okay, that's too big, and then I'm going to type this to 10 so that I'm changing, you know, the size of this. The thing you can do in Max is you can actually grab the gizmo itself, and I can just scale the gizmo. Now, when I do this, you'll see I don't grab on here because I don't want to accidentally non-proportional scale it. Okay. So what I do is hit the lock key, and now I can click out here and scale it, and it's going to proportionally scale it. Okay. Now, I think I want to rotate it a little bit here. So I was going to rotate it so it kind of goes along with the shoe. And then I can finish my scale. And I'm going to go for something, something about like that, and then I'll unlock it. Okay, now you'll see that this texture is going across here. Okay, eventually what I'm going to do is I'm going to make each one of these mapping coordinates unique, and then I can manipulate them separately. Okay, that way the leather shifts and changes a little bit on each one of these. Okay. Now I'm going to delete this off of here because I already have it on. Okay. And so I'm just going to go and we're just going to deal with this piece right here. So I can turn that one on, and there's the mapping coordinate for that one. Now you'll see that if I go to this one and I turn its back on, and you'll see these coordinates change a little bit here. Okay. And that's what I'm talking about, because what I eventually did was once I, got one piece done, which is the piece we're going to work on first, then I made these unique. All you have to do is right click and you're going to click make unique, and then I can manipulate this one. And so by moving it, then the pattern is on both of these, and they're similar patterns, but they're not identical patterns. We don't want the pattern to run across this like they're identical because they're separate pieces of leather. So that's the reason I did it that way. Okay, so that's the gizmo that gets me that piece of leather on there. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do some renders of these so you can kind of see it as we go along. So as I do the render, I'm going to pause this each time. Okay, all right, so I'm going to set this render up. I'm going to pause it and I'll come back after it finishes rendering. Okay, so now you can see there's the render and you've got your leather on here. Okay. Now, if you look really hard, you can kind of see where the seam is a little bit on the titleable texture, but you really won't see this once I get the final piece in here. Okay, when I get finished with this, with staining it and everything. So there's the initial shader, with the initial leather on there. Now, how I created this initial leather itself is I started off the shader with an arch in design, and then it's got templates in here, and I went down and got the one called leather. Okay. Now it comes in with some procedural textures, which are pretty nice, but I'm not using them. Sometimes I use those, but not for this one. So I just deleted those out of there. And then this was the setup of the shader as initially was. Now what they've got this set up for is highlights with FG only, which basically turns this reflectivity off, and it's just a specular, and I wanted reflection on mine. So I turned that off. I increased and then I went and did some adjustments. I increased the glossy samples, and I adjusted the reflection and the glossiness until I got what I wanted. But that's how I initially got the shader. And then, of course, I named the shader Boot Leather. You always want to name your shaders, okay? Now, the other thing that I did was I came in and I started putting the bump map in, okay? I created a bump map, and I created, what I did was I took the bitmap, the leather bitmap, and I put it in a color correction node, okay? Now, I'll just create another color correction node here just so you can see it. A color correction node is just a node that actually you can generate colors. So I can come in here and click here, and I can generate a color. You know, it can use to generate colors, or if you plug a map into it, then I can manipulate the colors, okay, which is what I did. So I plugged it into a color correction node and then told it to do monochrome. And so then it gives me a black and white version of that. Okay. Now, initially that black and white version was kind of watered down for a bump map. And so what I did is I went in here to my advanced setting down here, my lightness. And what I initially do is come to my gamma contrast right here, and I turn this to 0 and this one to 0. And then I start adjusting it from there, and then I can get a high contrast. You kind of want a high contrast to get the map that you want. Did a test render on that, and then it seemed like that it was the opposite of what I wanted. So I ran it through another color correction node in which I just inverted it. And then that got me my bump that I wanted in here. So I'm going to render that real quick. I'm going to go ahead and unplug the diffuse out of it so you can just see the bump by itself. Okay, I'm going to pause while I render that. Okay, so there's the bump map on there. Okay. So, and I pushed it really high. I usually, when I first put my bump maps on, I push them pretty high. I'm going to, because I'm going to stack several up, and then I can adjust it back down. I kind of push it and then back off of it a little bit later. So you can see I put a setting of 2, and that's pretty high in there. Okay, so let's go ahead and plug our diffuse back in there, and then let's go ahead and render this and see what it looks like with both of those on there. Okay, he's finishing up rendering here, and now you can see the leather with the bump in there. It's looking pretty nice. Okay, so the next thing that I did is now I'm going to start staining this. Okay, so I came in here and loaded a concrete that I downloaded. Okay, so just to show you how I did that, I went in here and did a search for concrete. Now, in this stage, I'm not really wanting cracks like this. I just want something with a regular pattern on it to stain it. Okay, not really pock marks like that, but like this or this. The one I used was this one. Okay, this is the one I used, which means you can't use this one. Okay, and so then I take it into Photoshop. Okay, and then I want to make it so that it's kind of titleable. It's just pseudo titleable, but it's titleable. So the first thing I have to do is to take lighting information out of it, because it's got lighting information, which makes it hard to create a titleable. So what I do is I make a duplicate of this, and then I run a high pass filter on it. Okay, high pass filter is filter, other, high pass, and then you're trying, if you go too far to the left, it really kills the pattern, but you're trying to find this happy spot in here where you still keep the nature of the pattern, but you're taking out lighting information. Okay. And so it went from there to there, and you can see it's pretty flat now. Okay. Then I wanted to put the color back in it. Now this seems like it's gray, but there is some color in this. So I just duplicate this one and I put it back on top, and then I turn it to a color blending mode. So all it's doing is putting the color back into it. Okay. So then I copy that collapse. So in other words, I go, I select all and then copy merge, which is Control-Shift-C, and then I paste it back in. And then I do an offset on this. Okay. So you have to know how big the image is, image size. And then I take a calculator and I divide this in half, and then I'm going to go filter, other, offset, and then I put those numbers in there, and it's going to offset it and put the seam back in the center. Okay. So once I have the seam in center, then I'm just putting a layer mask on it, and then I'm coming in here and I'm just painting out the seams. Okay. And now you can see I've painted out the seam. So it's just what it's doing is showing the piece underneath it is what it does. Okay. So that, you know, and you can see this would not be a very good titleable texture if I was going to use this straight up as concrete because there's too much variation in it, but I'm just using it for a stain. And so this will work fine. Okay. And so then I always run my offset back on it. And so now here is a version of the same thing, but I've taken the lighting information out and it's titleable. Okay. Okay. So I saved that out and that's what I have in here. Okay. And so what I'm doing is running that into my composite. Okay. And I've got it as an overlay. Okay. Now I've got this at 55%. I'm going to do it 100 right now so you can see it. And then what we're doing is, you'll see this just lays on top of that. Okay. Now I put this mapping channel on 2. Okay. So that I can use a different coordinate than what's on this. They're on different layers. I want a different coordinate because this bitmap's a different size than that. And I want to be able to manipulate it separately. Okay. So I came in here and made another mapping coordinate, another UVW map coordinate. Now I name these. You can right click on these and rename them. So I name them for what they are. Okay. And I say what this is a stain. And then I put a number, which is what number the mapping channel. This is map channel 2. You'll see this first one was on mapping channel 1. Okay, so let's go ahead and turn this on so you can see it. So if I click show, you'll be able to see that in our viewport now. And now you can see if I take this gizmo and I move the gizmo around, I'm actually, you know, taking that and being able to manipulate it to get that exactly where I wanted it. Okay. And so this allows me, it's like I'm putting these on different layers. Okay. And then I'm able to manipulate the layer. Now, to get the proportions correct on this, okay, what I did was I went down here and clicked Bitmap Fit because you can see this one is not a cube. I did not want this one a cube because this image is not square, okay? So that's where a lot of people screw up is they'll put a UVW map, but by default, a UVW map will snap to the size of the object and it distorts and stretches your bitmap. So we go down to do a Bitmap Fit. Then we pick the bitmap that we're using. Okay, so I'm using the concrete. And then it will automatically size the gizmo to be the correct proportions to fit the bitmap, so there's no stretching on the bitmap. So Bitmap Fit is a cue to this to not get stretching in your bitmaps. Okay, then that just puts that on top of it. But then what we're doing is we're coming back in here and we're putting this on here as a stain. I did it as an overlay, sometimes multiply. I kind of play with these. And then that's going to be pretty dark on there. Okay, we'll go ahead and render it that way just so you can see it. Okay, so you can see as this is finishing rendering how it overlays that stain on top of there and just gives this an irregular nature to it, okay? So that's what you're trying to do is to load these stains up, you know, subtly. Now I've got this way too dark on here. Now the other thing I did was to also, I rotated my cube, my box map a little bit. That way this seam is not in the same place that the other seam was. Okay, that way one is running over and putting a seam in a different place. And so you kind of overwrite these seams so you don't see them. Okay. All right. So the next thing that I wanted to do was to put some cracks on it. Okay. So I went back and did a search for concrete cracks, a bunch of those, picked one that I liked, which was this one. Okay. Which means you can use this one. Okay. And I'm going to use this to put some cracks onto the surface. Okay, and I did the same thing with it. I took it into Photoshop and I took it, did an offset and, you know, did a, you know, painted in my mask, okay, to get my final piece that I wanted, then offset it back and I saved that, okay. Okay, so now I wanted to material editor here. Okay, so then that's what I did is I loaded this one in. Now I did the same thing. I put this on map channel 3. Okay, so then I added another map channel on here, made this 3. I did a bitmap fit so that this fit that particular proportions of that one. Okay, let's turn this one on so we can see it in our viewport. There you go. And so this gizmo number 3, it actually controls that one, you can see. Okay, so then I'm laying that one on top. Okay, so then that one I laid on top as an overlay with 71% to add the little cracks on top of there. Okay, so let's go ahead and render that so you can see what that looks like. Okay, that adds some little veins in here. Okay, and so that's pretty much the diffuse. That's how it sits in the final piece. Okay, now I do come back in and manipulate in the bump as well. Okay, so I took that same piece and I ran it through a color correction to drop it into the composite, and then I laid it on top. And I ran it through a color correction. It got me a really kind of stark, and then I'm laying that back on top with darken. So all it's doing is adding the black back into it. Black is down. Okay. So it'll push those make little crevices in it. Okay. So then the next thing that I did was, I needed to get the eyelets in here. Okay. I wanted a metal for the eyelets. So all I did was I went back down to my base mesh, and then I'm just picking that. Okay. So I'm going at the sub-object level. And the way I pick these is I just pick this little edge right here, holding the shift key down and then picking this edge. That'll give it all the way around for me. And then I grow that, and then I put the material on it. Now, what I did was I made a selection set of these. So in other words, I would select one and save it, select one, save it, select one, save it, save it. And then I ended up making selection sets of those so that I could come back later. Now, I didn't do these up here because you can't see these, so I just did these down here. Okay. Then I made a material for that. Now, I've got an eyelet material in here that I made right here. Okay. And basically all I did for that was I took an arch in design. I used a preset of copper. Copper is a good metal preset. And then I just altered the colors until I got something that I liked. Okay. And then I assigned that to those. Okay. Now you'll see this weird stretching and this throws people off. That's because once I go down here, I'm turning off all those mapping coordinates. Okay. Now, if I click this button, this is show end results, so I can be down here and see all of that. But that's why all of that happens. And what happens a lot of times, people forget and they stay down here and render, and you get all kind of weird stuff. By being here, you're cutting all this off. So you have to make sure you go back up to the top of your stack before you do your renders. Okay. And then that gets me my metal eyelets in there. Okay. All right. Let's end our isolation. Okay. For the rubber. Okay. Now, this technique that I did on here, now all I had to do was to come on each one of these. You'll see it stretching in here. And I just, since we had initially put this map on all of these, then all of these, and this one up here too, have the right mapping coordinates on it. And then all I did was come into the gizmo and move them around a little bit. That way this pattern did just run right across. It offset. Okay. So the leather has the same nature. You could tell it was cut from the same lot, okay, but it was stitched differently, and so they shouldn't match up going from one to the other, okay. All right, on the rubber, okay, how I did the rubber was a very similar technique where I came in here and I made rubber sole material. And then that was the same way. I came in here, took an arch and designed a template. There's a template for rubber in here. Personally, their rubber was too gray for me, and so I came in and made it darker. You never want to make it black. You can make it pretty dark, but don't go all the way black on it, okay? Then what I did was I came in and I just wanted to use these cracks. I didn't want the leather, just these cracks, and then I dropped this into my bump. And you'll see that gets me a nice a bump on there, which will make little cracks in the rubber on the sole, okay? So if we go back and look at the piece, you'll see there's little cracks in there. And so this didn't cost me anything in render time because I'm using the same bitmap that I'm using for the other, but I get a nice crack in that, okay? The only other thing that I do, which is a kind of little trick with rubber, is on the specular highlight, you don't want it to be white. You want it to be a real light lavender because it's made from a petroleum product, and so it's made from oil. And so it has a little bit of a lavender sheen instead of a white sheen, okay? And so that's what I did for the rubber sole, okay? Now for the laces, okay? What I did for the laces, and let me just pick them here. And all I'm doing for the laces is using a checkerboard pattern. So I'm using a checkerboard procedural, and I'm just tiling it really, really, really small. And then once I have that the size that I want, I made a copy of this and changed it to black and white and put it into my bump. And that's what gave me the actual laces in there. That's just a checker pattern, okay? But it works great. Now for these little lace tips that are in there, what I did on that was I came back down to my base and I selected those tips, and then I did an extrude, okay? And I extruded them in. So they just went in a little bit, and then I applied a lace tips material, and basically this was just an arch and design. I didn't use a template. I just started my arch and design. I changed it to a pretty dark color. And then I just adjusted my reflectivity and glossiness until I got what I wanted for kind of a plastic kind of look on the tips. Okay. And that's how I got that on there. And let's see. Okay. That's pretty much all that you have to do to get a pretty nice look. Now, I did go another step further. You guys don't have to do this for my class, but if you want to, you can. I actually wanted some dirt to be on the piece. So what I do is I come in here, and the way I start this is I just start off with a standard shader, okay? And I'm going to go ahead and apply this to just these two pieces right here so we can see what's going on with this. I'm going to apply this standard shader. Now, you know, I have problems with people all the time trying to do this technique and they can't get it to work, and it's because they don't do this step. They try to do it on their shader, and you really need to get this done right without being on your shader, okay? So I put a standard shader on here, and then in the diffuse, I'm going to put a mix node. A mix node just allows you to mix two colors together. So what I want is some really bright colors so it's easy to see this. So I'm going to go for a hot pink in here, and then for a real bright blue in here. And then what I'm going to do is put an ambient occlusion node in here, as the mix to mix them together. Now, to get an ambient occlusion node, that's a map. It's under mental ray, and it's at the top, ambient reflective occlusion. What this does is looks for the crease between two things, and it puts shading in there. So it's usually used to add shadowing to an object, but because of those attributes, I'm going to actually use it to get me dirt in there. Okay. And so the things you're going to adjust are max distance, the spread, and the samples. So the max distance, when you leave it at 0, you kind of have a tendency to think that turns it off, but actually it makes it like it's infinity. So we want to give this a certain distance. Okay. And we want to turn this up. Now, normally, if we're using this for shadows, we would turn the samples up to be really smooth, but that's what's kind of nice about this. This is going to be dirt, so I'm going to turn it down so it calculates faster. Okay, so let's render this and see what we got. Okay, so you can see there how it's dropping that pink in there. Okay. Now, I wanted to give it a little bit more, okay, so I'm just going to crank this up a little bit and crank this up a little bit, and that's going to give me a little more pink in there, but this is going to allow me to add dirt into my piece, okay? So now what I'm going to do is once I have that, I no longer need this other node, okay? I don't need that anymore because all I was trying to do was to configure this ambient occlusion, okay? And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and I'm going to go composite and I'm going to add a new layer in here, okay, to put it on top, okay. All right, so I'm going to run this directly into the mask, and then what I want to do is to drop a color in, and I'm going to use black. So in other words, I'm using black on the new layer. So there's black is in here, and then this ambient occlusion node is plugged into the mask slot. This is just a color correction node. I'm using black, okay? And a lot of times I don't use black, but for this one, it's so dark, I'm going to use black because I want to punch it up, okay? So we're just going to go ahead and reapply our textures to this, okay? Just going to fetch back to the one I had before. Okay, so let me plug these back in again. Okay, so one more node. This is the color into layer 4, and then I'm going to run the ambient occlusion as the mask in there, okay? And then let's go ahead and render that so that you can see what that looks like. Okay, so that's putting some little subtle darkness, like some dirt in there, okay? Now, a lot of times I want to increase what that is, and sometimes I want to go light with it. So instead of going dark with this, sometimes I'll go light with it so that I want it to be a lighter dirt on there. You just have to decide what you want to do. But the thing about it is I can't add more to it because it's based on this node. But what you can do is to gang them up, which is what I did on this one in the final render. So what I did is I came in and added another layer, and then I added the same nodes back in again. So I added this color back to 5. And, oh, and by the way, I didn't explain this. When you do the ambient occlusion and when you put it in there, it'll be backwards. Okay. So in other words, it's going to reverse what it needs to be. So what you do is, you run it through a color correction and you invert it. Okay. And then that's where you're going to plug into the mask. And then I'm going to plug it into here too. And so this gangs it up, and then I turn this top one on to a multiply. And so it's like adding more into it to press it to be more prominent in there. Okay. And so that's a really cool little thing to be able to add some dirt into some of your crevices and stuff. You can see a slight dirt that's being around all of these rivets and around in here. You can see it in there. It's a slight thing, but it adds a little bit of realism to it. Okay. Now you don't have to do that for me. But you can if you want to. So I think that pretty much covers everything I did to create the piece. And so I would like for you to create something like this. So what's nice about this method is I don't have to do any unwrapping. And here's the other cool thing about this. This node is not specific to any specific thing. So now we've got a leather belt, and we've got a leather shoulder harness, and this same leather can be put on both of those. So you're building a node that I can actually save. I can actually make a material library and save this node into it. And I could bring it up and use it in another scene that I was going to use. Okay. So building a titleable texture, and you can do procedural textures this way too. You can save these in a library and then use them over and over and over again, and then you can tweak them. Whereas when you're unwrapping something, you can only use that one time because it's specific to that unwrap. And so that's the nice thing about this leather. Once it takes a little bit to get this the way you want it. You have to tweak it a little bit. You finally get it. But then when you finally get it, you can put it on a bunch of stuff. And then so it's a little slow at first, but then it's really fast. Plus, then I don't have to go through all the pain in the butt of unwrapping things. Okay. Now for my Maya users. Okay. Let me just show you, the kind of the structure you would do for Maya. So you would go to, mental ray materials. Then our go-to is the Mia material. Okay. So that's the Mia material is the same thing as arch and design. So, when I'm doing my lecture and I'm saying an arch and design for my, Maya users, that's a Mia material. Okay. All right. So, and then for layers, you go to under Maya, you go to other textures, and there's your layer node. Okay, crashed on me for a second there. Okay, so there's my Mia node, and then you're going to go to other textures and you bring in a layer node. Okay, now this layer node is pretty much just like the composite node in Max, and so it makes layers in here. Okay, and as you click, you make a new layer. To get rid of a layer, you hit the X. This is kind of backwards though, because every one of these layers, this is the first one you make is always on top. Then these are going underneath it. So you wouldn't see these. Okay. But so, here's our shader. Okay. And so all we're going to do is put this layered shader into your diffuse. And now it's driving, the diffuse. Okay. Of your channel, which is the same thing that I was doing over there. So I'm going to name this composite. So now it's the same thing as the composite node over there. Okay. So then I want to load a bitmap in here. So I go to, my 2D textures. I go to file. Okay. Pull this over. So now I can go to file. And so then we would go in and we would get, let's see, we need to go to here, boots, scene assets, images. Okay. And there's my titleable, leather. Okay. So go to my composite node, and then I'm going to plug that in for my color. And so that will drop that in. Okay, so there's your pattern on there. Okay, so now what I want to do is to drop our to do staining. So I drop another file in here, another image file. Let's pull this over. Okay, so we're going to name this one, this is my leather. Okay, and then what we're going to go on this one is let's load in that cracked concrete. Concrete that we pulled in. So we'll call this one, this is our stain. Okay, so you go back to your composite node, that layer, and just click here to add a new one. Okay, now center mouse button, I can drag this back on top so that this new one's on top. It's kind of reversed to me. Top is on the left and the bottom's on the right, but every time you put one, it's putting it underneath it. It's kind of the opposite of Photoshop. It's kind of weird. I don't know why they do this, but they do it backwards. So every time I add a layer, it adds it at the bottom of the stack instead on top of the stack. Okay, so then I'm going to go ahead and drop this concrete into that one. Okay. So it's laying on top of the other one. And then here's your blending modes. Okay, right down here. So subtraction, blending this on top of the other one, multiply, however I want to do it. okay, and it's laying it on top of the other one, and then this is my percentage, you know, like I was saying, 100% or 50% or whatever, so here's your percentage, okay? So this layer node, like I said, this is under other textures right here. This is equal to the composite node in Max, okay? And now you're just layering your textures on it, okay? You get to each layer by clicking on it here. To get rid of a layer, you hit the plus button. To add a layer, you just click in here and it adds a layer. Click that little X to get rid of it. And like I say, every time you add one, it puts it below it. So you use the center mouse button and then you drag it over to put it on top. Okay. All right. So that's how you work the same kind of a system in Maya. Okay. So hopefully that helped everybody, and you can use this technique. It's a fun technique when you get used to it, and you can make some pretty stunning things. So hopefully you'll do this. This is what I would like you to do. You don't have to do the ambient occlusion node, but I'd like you to do the other. Okay. Thank you very much.